To present Professor Jim Bowyer.
All right, so in this presentation, we're going to talk about carbon implications of wood construction, and I'll begin with wood formation in growing forests and carbon capture in the growth process. Then we'll look at conversion of harvested trees into finished products, and then into building components, and then on into building construction. And we'll track carbon along the way. Wood, as you know, is formed through a process of photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide is captured from the air and water is taken up from the ground, and we get a combination of leaves, and sugars are formed, principally cellulose, but a number of 5 and 6 carbon sugars. And these are used in the process of wood formation. Those sugars, in fact, are building blocks of wood. And the result is that trees and the wood they contain can store vast quantities of carbon. On average, if you look at tree species all over the world, the carbon content of dry wood is around 47 to 52%. So as a general average, wood is about 1/2 carbon by dry weight. And that carbon remains in the wood when the trees are harvested and converted to products, which creates a new carbon pool. So we get considerable amounts of carbon stored within wood, and that carbon remains going forward. As I mentioned, wood is produced using solar energy. You look at this very useful, complex material. It's produced through nature using solar energy. And as a result, it takes relatively little additional energy to convert wood into useful products. If you consider lumber, for example, it need only be shaped, cut to shape, and dried. It doesn't take very much energy compared to alternative materials to go through that process. If we talk about more complex engineered wood products, wood composite materials and so forth, they are more complex and of course take more energy to produce. But when the energy needed is compared to materials that might be used alternatively, the energy consumption is still significantly less. In addition to that, production of wood products typically results in consumption of markedly less fossil energy. And I'll use the United States as an example. In the U.S., wood products producers are typically 60 to 70% energy self-sufficient. Many plants are totally energy self-sufficient, using sawdust, bark, and other residues to produce their own energy, which is biogenic energy and not fossil. And so you don't get fossil emissions resulting from that process, in that you use far less fossil energy. All right, so what does this look like quantitatively? This is a table that comes out of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the left 2 columns. So what's shown here is total process emissions, tons of carbon per ton of product, for a number of different building materials. And if you look down the left-hand column, framing lumber, concrete block, all of these materials typically used in building construction. If we look at the 2 lines that are highlighted in green, framing lumber and medium density fiberboard, those are the 2 wood products on this chart. Medium density fiberboard is wood that's broken down into individual fiber and then put back together in a panel form. So if you look down the center column, you see process emissions, framing lumber and concrete, ton per ton, about the same magnitude of emissions, almost exactly the same. And then we see greater emissions for medium density fiberboard. We go on down the list and look at the 2 pink lines, steel, first 100% recycled and then steel. Very seldom is steel made out of 100% recycled. For example, cold form steel used in steel framing members and so forth is typically about 30% recycled. So if we look between the 0.22 and the 0.694 down lower, steel studs are around 0.4, which is something like 14 times greater than the process emissions associated with wood. Notice plastic, molded plastic, that's a proxy for vinyl, a very high number, and then you see aluminum. All right, if you look at the left hand or at the right hand column here, notice that all of those numbers, virtually all of those numbers, are exactly the same as in the center column, except for a couple. And you'll notice two of these numbers are negative, and they happen to be for both for the wood products. What does a negative number mean? It means that the carbon stored within those finished products is a greater quantity than all of the emissions, carbon emissions that resulted in their manufacture. In effect, we've got a net negative carbon emission. The only other material in here that has significant carbon storage is plastic. There's a lot of carbon stored in plastic, but of course that's fossil carbon. Now you look at these numbers, and of course you don't use equal tonnages of materials in buildings. So let's look then at what happens if you start putting these materials together as you would in a building. If you look over to the right, we're looking, for example, at what might happen if you put materials together in a wall assembly. All right, so starting from the bottom, I've got a couple different ways to put a wall together. We could have wood studs with plywood sheathing over that and a vinyl siding on the outside. That's a common construction used in the US and Canada. We might replace the plywood sheathing with oriented strand board. Next up, we'll look at steel with a plywood sheathing and a vinyl siding. Then steel with oriented strand board with a vinyl siding. Then going above that, if we replace the vinyl siding in both cases with plywood, so now we've got wood studs, plywood sheathing, plywood siding, and so on. And then finally, a concrete block. The zero here represents zero carbon emissions. Everything to the right of that zero is net emissions. Everything to the left is net negative emissions. And notice the fairly large differences between these various wall assemblies. Those that involve construction with wood are all net negative in terms of carbon emissions. Those that are looking at alternative materials, steel and concrete, significant positive emissions. If we take those wall assemblies now and keep going and actually start building a building, this is a large office building, actually a large office laboratory building, which happens to be the National Forest Products Laboratory of Canada in Vancouver, BC. In constructing this building, it was designed by architects, and then the architects and civil engineers were asked to go back and redesign the building, looking at three alternatives, building dominantly out of wood, steel, or concrete. And they did a life cycle assessment of these three alternatives. And so I'll just show you the energy and carbon emissions implications of this construction. Look first at the total energy use column, second from the left, and you can see some pretty big differences. The lower the number, of course, the better from an environmental point of view. And you'll notice that the wood construction uses considerably less energy than the next lower alternative, the concrete building, and then the steel building is more than double that of wood. If you go to the center column, above grade energy use, that's the most important one because all of these buildings are on a concrete foundation. So if you factor that out and look at it, now the next lowest alternative, concrete, uses 70% more energy. The steel construction about 2.5 times as much energy. Finally, if you look at relative CO2 emissions, notice that the order of things now is reversed. The concrete building is the poorer performer, again with significantly higher, actually 81% higher CO2 emissions than wood. And the reason for that, of course, is that when you take calcium carbonate, as shown here in the lower right, calcium carbonate is limestone. You put that in a lime kiln, heat it up to about 1700 to 2000 degrees. You convert calcium carbonate to lime, and you get carbon dioxide as an emission, a vast emission. And it doesn't really make any difference how energy efficient you are in that lime kiln. The basic chemistry of cement formation means you get vast quantities of CO2. So just to kind of sum this up, and I guess before I go to summary, let me just say one other thing. If we look at this building, we've got lower energy, we've got lower carbon emissions, we've got net carbon storage in that wood building, and we wind up with a building that's typically less expensive both at time zero and over the building life. So just to summarize, wood captures carbon from the atmosphere and stores it within trees and the products made from them. It's created using solar energy and can be converted to products with relatively little additional energy and vastly less fossil energy. And when you consider all of this, low embodied energy, low embodied fossil energy, and long-term storage potential, carbon storage potential, greater use of wood in construction can help to reduce carbon emissions quite significantly. Thank you for listening.